Have you ever ignored a warning sign because it was easier to ignore than to face what it might mean? Could an old house hold on to something long after its previous occupants have gone? Have you ever walked into a room and felt instantly that something was terribly wrong? How do you explain a presence that seems to grow stronger when two certain people get close? And what happens when something paranormal you thought you dealt with doesn't actually leave? Hopefully, today will give us at least some of those answers. Or maybe it will leave us scratching our heads even more on today's installment of The Dark Paranormal.
Live from Liverpool, The Dark Paranormal with Kevin Eustace.
Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 8 of The Dark Paranormal. I cannot believe next week will be our penultimate episode of the season already. Genuinely, it has flown by. Now today's episode, as we like to do, we like to try and ramp up what we believe is the fear factor as we get closer to our finale. And today's email from Ben helps us with that mission. Because the email I'm about to read to you is perhaps one of the most unusual, terrifying, question-laden episodes I think we may ever do. I will point out a slight trigger warning. This episode does reference the intentional cutting of oneself, but not from a place of self-harm, and I appreciate that sounds oxymoronic, but that's the situation. It's mentioned just the once also, but for anyone with little ones, or if that topic in general would change your mood for the day if it was sprung upon you, this is a forewarning. With that said, as usual, a huge thank you to all of you for the correspondence you've sent in this week. Yes, we're always accepting submissions irrelevant of the time of season, but yes, if you're sat on a wonderful submission, please send it in and it may be featured in next season's main show. Otherwise, if it's shorter, it will find an audience, believe me, either on Dark Bites or a minisode, etc. And you could submit your experience by clicking in the show notes where it says Submit My Experience, or go to thedarkparanormal.com, click on Submit My Experience. Also, within those same show notes, you'll find a link that will give you a free trial at our highest tier for our Patreon, meaning you will not only receive early ad-free releases, you can also gain access to the Patreon-only podcast, Dark Bites, and its entire 190-plus hour catalogue, and also access to the current bi-weekly news show, After Dark, where I take an unfiltered look, unedited, 30 minutes of me just looking at a camera and talking about what we've discussed that week. And we've added a community chat section, so our patrons can discuss amongst themselves their own theories and ideas, or just generally get to know each other. And believe me, if that takes off the way those Patreons have built that Patreon, it will be the safest place online to discuss the paranormal. But as ever, the questions we posited at the start have swung back round and require looking at. So please, lower the lights, make yourself comfortable, and most importantly of all, leave your disbelief at the door. As I read out Ben's email, tell me who you are. Hi Kev. My name's Ben, if you want to use it. I've thought about this for long enough that I'm past caring who knows. Anyone in my life who may recognise these events already, well, they've lived through them alongside me. And those who didn't probably wouldn't believe it anyway. As with many submissions you receive, I will use different names for everyone else involved. That feels like the least I can do for them. I'll also pre-apologise up front if any of this comes out disjointed. I began writing it 4 separate times over the past 2 years, and I've deleted every draft. Not because I'm embarrassed in the slightest, because every time I get to a certain point, something in me stops going further. Like a physical sensation, a heaviness in my chest that tells me to stop. I'm feeling it now, and I'm ignoring it. I found your show about 18 months ago, during a particular slow week at work. I'm a secondary school librarian. There are lots of quiet hours. Lot of time to fill with something in your ears. I've been through most of the major paranormal shows before I come across yours, and most of them felt like entertainment dressed up as an experience. Yours didn't. And that's why I'm writing this. You see, I've had strange encounters my whole life. Not constantly. It's not like I've been haunted from birth. But enough of them spread across enough years that I stopped being able to explain them away. Some were very small. Some were what you would call average. One was not. I grew up in Northumberland, on the coast. It's not a tourist part, it's a working part. My grandmother raised me in a terraced house about 4 streets back from the harbour, and the sound I would fall asleep to every night for the first 15 years of my life was either wind from the North Sea or the low moan of the foghorn off the headland. You get used to unsettling sounds when you grow up somewhere like that. It was everything else I had trouble with. My grandmother was a deeply practical woman, but she had what I'd call a layered relationship with faith. She'd been raised Methodist, converted to nothing in particular in her 30s, but maintained a quiet and completely unironic belief in what she would call the old ways. She knew things. Plant remedies that worked better than they should have. A way of reading the weather that was never wrong. She told me once, very matter-of-factly, that her own mother had been able to find lost things. Not just objects, people. By holding something that once belonged to them. She told me her grandmother before her had been asked to leave 2 separate villages. Not because anyone could prove she'd done anything, but because things went badly for people who crossed her. She said all of this the same way she'd tell me what the tides were doing, like it was just general information. She wasn't particularly interested in passing any of it on formally, but she didn't discourage me when I started reading about it myself around the age of 12 or 13. She would just watch from afar. Occasionally, she'd correct me about something if I misunderstood. Otherwise, she left me to it. When I was 15, she had to move. A combination of her health and the house become genuinely unmanageable. Damp in the walls, a landlord who wouldn't lift a finger, the usual story. So we moved inland, to a market town about 20 miles from the coast. The house we moved into had been built in the late 1800s, extended piecemeal over the following decades in the way those old houses have been, where each addition slightly contradicts the one before. The bathroom was in a small room at the back of the house. Rooms would lead into rooms with almost no hallway to speak of, each one connecting to the next through doorways that felt slightly too narrow, as if the house had been designed to funnel you all in one direction. The front room and the dining room were separated by a half wall with a wide central gap. No door, just an opening, with a support pillar on either side running floor to ceiling. It was the only route between the 2 rooms at ground level. I did what I always did with a new space. I explored it before we moved anything in. That ground floor was odd, But it wasn't alarming. It was the upper storage space that stayed with me. You'd access it through a hatch set into the ceiling of what the letting agent had optimistically described as a walk-in wardrobe, basically a wide cupboard connected to the 2 rear bedrooms. This hatch had 2 latches, a sliding bolt and a hook and eye. Both were unfastened when I climbed the narrow pull-down ladder. The previous tenant had left things. That alone was strange. The attic was unfinished. Bare joints, exposed insulation between them, loose floorboards covering roughly a third of the floor, with nothing in place to fix them. I didn't go further than I needed to. Because what stopped me was what was directly in front of the hatch. A trestle table. The old folding kind. But this was no ordinary trestle table, because upon it were 4 taxidermy animals arranged in a specific size order. A fox, 2 stoats, and a large crow, its wings pinned back. These were very old. The glass eyes had that slightly wrong quality that older taxidermy always has. The iris colour a fraction off from anything usual, uncanny valley even. The body positioned just too still to be restful. The fox had been mounted mid-term, head looking back over its shoulder, glass eyes fixed on something behind it. I had an immediate specific aversion to all of them, something I couldn't entirely account for. I went back down and I closed that hatch. I fastened the deadbolt and I put the hook in the eye. I told myself I'd deal with them later, and I forgot about them almost immediately. We were moving 15 years of an accumulated life, and it took everything I had. The first time I went back up was when my uncle visited and asked for the tour. He went up the ladder ahead of me. I noticed, following him, he didn't touch any of the latches. They'd already been undone. I went up anyway. The fox was no longer looking back over its shoulder. It was facing forward, straight ahead, aimed directly at the hatch, at us. I said nothing to my uncle. I told him I thought we should head back down. He shrugged and agreed, and again I ensured I fastened both latches behind me. That evening I went back and I placed a seal on the door, a barrier, a statement of intent, drawn from what my grandmother had taught me and reinforced with what I'd learnt myself. And I check it every few days until it faded to the back of my mind. The house was always slightly dim, not in a way you could raise with a landlord, just in a way you noticed. Like the light never quite reached the corners. My grandmother died 18 months after we moved in. I'd gone out that evening with my friend Yara, just driving. The kind of aimless circling you do when you need to be somewhere out of your head for a while. When I got back, I rang a friend to check in on her and started pacing the way I do on calls. 2 passes past my grandmother's bedroom door, and a thread of light shone underneath, which I'd assumed meant she'd fell asleep reading. Then something shifted in the air. Not dramatically, just a quality change, like the moment before a power cut. I knocked, no answer. I opened the door, and she was on the floor beside the bed, cold but not yet stiff. I pressed her emergency button repeatedly, and I gave the operator what details I could. I called Yara before the ambulance arrived. The next few hours are a sequence of faces and sounds rather than any memory I can properly order. By the time it was just me and Yara left in the house, I was past numb. I found the whiskey I'd had in my room since Christmas, and I drank until I didn't need to think anymore. I handled the weeks that followed badly. There's no version of this that reflects well on me, so I'll say it plainly. I spent the better part of a month drunk. Not taking the edge off drunk, methodical. First thing in the morning drunk. Because the alternative was sitting in the silence of that house, that too dark house, knowing she died on the floor while I was out driving around. My friends eventually intervened the way friends do, showing up without warning, calculating with 100% accuracy that I'd have declined if they'd have asked first. It was my best friend, Declan, Yara, her partner Owen, and my friend Britta, and her girlfriend Lisa. They brought alcohol with them, which was a strange intervention choice, and a selection of increasingly desperate social lubricants, including a charity shop croquet set that someone had repurposed as a living room game using mugs as hoops. So we'd drink, we'd play stupid games, and for about maybe 3 hours, I felt close to normal. And that is when things began to seriously change. We were in the front room. Declan, my closest friend, who I'd known since I was 11, had been sitting beside me on the floor. He'd been quiet for a few minutes, which wasn't unusual. I nudged him when it was his turn. He didn't respond. I looked at him. He was staring at the gap in the half wall. Not looking through it at something beyond, looking at it, at the space itself. His face was a complete blank. A blank in a way that faces simply aren't. Even when someone's spaced out or heavily drunk, there's always usually some sign of life. There was nothing. I told the others I was getting him some water and asked for help. Yara and I got him upright without much difficulty. He didn't resist, but he didn't assist either. Moving him felt like moving furniture. I led the way, pulling him by the hand toward the dining room. He stopped at the gap. Not slowed, stopped, as if he'd walked into glass. I turned around and he was stood still dead center of the opening. Yara behind him, both of them perfectly still. I pulled his arm harder and his arm moved just enough to confirm the joint was working at least, but his body didn't follow. Yara put both of her hands on his shoulders and pushed. He didn't move an inch. He didn't rock. It was like a statue. I let go and stepped back into the front room, looking all around him for an explanation. Something physical. Something I could point to and say, that's why. And then, without knowing why, I looked up. And I saw my grandmother's crucifix, still hanging where she'd fixed it on the support beam above the half wall after moving in. What happened next was not gradual. It was total. Every hair on my body stood on end. I had goose pimples on the skin of my neck. The absolute and immediate certainty of being watched from many more than one direction struck me like a thunderbolt. I turned toward my grandmother's bedroom. The door was open. Not ajar, open. The way it would be if someone had pushed through it fast. No one had been in that room since she died. I'd purposefully kept it closed, and I asked my friends very quietly who had opened the door. They all shook their heads. No one. I told them to stay with Declan, and I walked towards the bedroom. I didn't want to. Every part of me was pulling me the other way. I walked through the room to the cupboard, and I opened it, and I looked up at the hatch. Both latches were undone. The seal I'd placed on the door was gone. Not disturbed or degraded the way workings fade after time. Gone entirely, as though it had never been there. I came out of that room faster than I've ever moved. I grabbed my grandmother's car keys from the key hook by the door and told everyone to get Declan outside, and we all left immediately. In the apparent safety of the car, I said the word I'd been thinking but avoiding since I looked at Declan's face in that front room. Possessed. Britta laughed once. Then she looked at Declan in the back seat between Owen and Lisa, and she stopped laughing. He was sat upright, facing forward, eyes open, that same terrible absence on his face. His right hand was moving, slowly, rhythmically, fingers tapping against his knee in a sequence that matched nothing. Not a song, not a habit, just a pattern. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, 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 pause. Over and over. Then the sound started. It was low, repeated, a single flat note. Not quite a hum, not quite a tone, something between the two. And it seemed to come from a few inches in front of his mouth rather than from his mouth itself, as though whatever was producing it wasn't quite sat where it should have been. The tapping sound ran together in a way... The tapping and the sound ran together in a way that made my skin crawl. Owen, in the back seat beside him, pressed himself against the door without seeming to realise he was doing so. Despite her initial laughter, Britta quietly said, the tapping had started the moment we got him outside, but on his thigh. I drove to the church. My heart was in my mouth. I'd attended a faith school for my last 2 years and I knew the building, and I still believe, in the accumulated weight of sacred spaces regardless of the tradition that built them. But when we arrived, the doors were locked. Probably a post-vandalism change. I stood in that car park with Declan beside me, his fingers still running their sequence against his leg, the sound still hovering just beyond his lips, and I tried to think. Then it struck me. I thought of the Clifftop Memorial, 1/2 mile north of town on the headland. A stone cross erected after the First World War, overlooking the sea, maintained by the parish. It wasn't officially accessible at night, but there was no gate, just a footpath. I told the others where we were going and we drove. We parked at the coast road and walked up the path. This was February and the wind off the sea was vicious. Declan walked when guided, stopped when we stopped, made no effort of his own in any direction, except twice. On the path up, he suddenly pulled back hard toward the car. It took all 4 of us to hold him and keep him moving forward. The sound from just in front of his mouth had changed pitch by the time we reached the top. It was now lower, slower. We settled ourselves at the base of the cross. I worked through everything I had: sage, salt, blessed water, a binding knot, a spoken expulsion drawn from 3 separate traditions. Every protective piece of knowledge I'd accumulated across 15 years of reading and practice. Nothing shifted. Declan sat in the centre of it all, still tapping his fingers, that sound hovering in the air around him, and nothing I did seemed to touch it. Then I thought of blood. I know how that sounds. Some people do consider it categorically dark, evidence of intent to harm, full stop. I don't believe that, and I didn't then. Blood is a conductor. Every tradition has a version of this truth, including the one that has the crucifix hanging above that half wall in my grandmother's house. The power is in the intent, not the medium. I had my grandmother's straight razor in my kit. She'd used it for precise herb work, for scoring markings in candle wax, for anything that needed a clean and intentional edge. I'd taken it the same week she died without quite knowing why. I asked my friends to hold Declan still. Owen hesitated. He didn't know me well, he didn't know what I was and wasn't capable of. But Yara and Britta held Declan's arms without being asked twice. I made a shallow cut across his left palm, careful, skin deep. He looked straight at me. Not the blank forward stare, directly at me, focused, with an expression I can't adequately describe. But it wasn't Declan's expression. It was something using Declan's face to look at me, and knowing exactly what I was about to do. I then cut my own left palm. As I moved to press my hand against his, the sound rose. Not louder exactly, but denser, fuller, like the air between us had thickened with it. And then Declan screamed and threw himself backwards with a force that pulled both Yara and Britta off balance. Yara screamed to Owen to help, and it took all of them to hold him. I grabbed hold of his hand as best I could. The moment our palms met, I lost everything. Sound, sensation, spatial awareness, all of it gone at once. Replaced by a pressure so total it felt structural, like something was compressing the air around me. I said what I needed to say, I finished the working, and I felt the pressure break. And then I lost consciousness. I woke to Yara shaking me by the shoulders, saying my name. The sea was still below us, and Declan was sitting against the base of the cross, looking at me with an expression I've never fully found words for. Like he'd lived through something that had aged him, and been returned to his own body to find it February, and cold, and the rest of us staring at him from the grass. His hands were still. He asked meekly what had happened. He said the last thing he remembered was playing croquet in the front room. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. For a long time it seemed like it was. Declan got on with his life without incident for several years. Then the first time we ended up living in the same town again, not the same house, just the same town, things began to go wrong in the way they had in that house. Food would rot overnight. A dog he'd had for 6 years became inexplicably aggressive and bit him. Small structural problems appeared in both of our apartments at the same time. The kind that have explanations but accumulate too quickly and too serendipitously to feel just coincidental. We both moved and things settled. But it's happened twice more since then. Different towns, different years, the same pattern. When we're apart, there's nothing. But if we're within a few miles of each other, it begins again. We've spoken about it, Declan and I, and we've arrived at the same conclusion. Whatever was in that house, whatever had been sitting behind those latches, watching from behind glass eyes, waiting for the right moment of grief and lower defences, somehow found its entire self in Declan. And by that cross, I didn't expel it that night. I split it. One half tethered to him, one half to me. And the two halves recognise each other across distance and want to be whole again. We still talk, but we've agreed we can never live near each other. We don't know yet what the safe distance is, and I'm not entirely sure I want to find out. Thank you for reading this, and if it makes it to air, thank you for that too. Ben. Well, Ben, thank you so much for giving us our 8th episode of this season. I'll be perfectly honest with you, I've never read an encounter like that. And I'll tell you why it fascinates me and also infuriates me. It infuriates me because I get the sense to get the full essence of this experience, I'd need to literally sit in a room with you for about 4 hours and get a complete breakdown of your entire history with the paranormal. Because there are certain, not necessarily cutscenes, but there are certain things which, and this is not on the fault of you as the writer, of course, but it's kind of taken as tacit that we understand what you mean when you say things like the workings, or when you touch on some of the craft elements of what you're attempting to do with Declan. That said, it also, which I do like, allows our brains to think of what those things can be, to fill in those blanks. And thankfully, there were not so many blanks to negatively affect the experience at all. Now, you guys know I love talking about validators. Validators meaning something that I think would not be included in an experience unless it was completely legitimate. Now, there are 2 validators for me within this experience. One is physical evidence, which is a series of photographs Ben has shared with me. One even showing the after effects of the palm cuttings. And 2, and this is exceptionally rare when we hear an experience from someone like Ben. If you'll note throughout the entire experience, Ben doesn't refer to himself as sensitive or psychic or able to pick up on certain things. And if he did so, he'd done it in such a way that right now, after reading the experience, I couldn't tell you when it was. Normally, and rightly, if somebody does have that sort of knowledge or experience, they let us know within the experience that they have that ability. Ben's lack of telling us that, and instead just describing what he actually done, to use a really bad analogy, it would be like if we received an email of someone who talked very technically about changing the tyres on a car and giving it a full service without ever disclaiming they were a mechanic. And that for me is a validator. It's the first time, experience-wise, I've read somebody's experience and picked up the fact that they have some sort of ability, as opposed to them telling me directly. And that's why I found this fascinating. As well as the idea that there is something, be it a deity, an entity, or whichever, which seems to have split itself in 2. And the thought that it grows stronger the closer in proximity you 2 get, it blows my mind. I don't even have a theory as yet as to what that could be. But Ben, sincerely, thank you for one of the most mind-bending and intriguing experiences we've had in a long while. And if any of you guys have any theories at all, get in touch via the show notes and let us know. But until next time, remember, when you're discussing the paranormal, always leave some of your disbelief at the door. And I'll see you next week for the penultimate episode of this season's Dark Paranormal.